The mountain mist hung thick over Coleridge that October morning in 1927, wrapping the hollow in a shroud of grey that seemed to muffle even the roosters crowing. Lady Sarah Pemberton Clark stood on the porch of the newly constructed Company House No. 1, her kid leather boots already dusted with the red clay that stained everything in these God-forsaken hills. She wrinkled her nose at the smell, coal smoke, wood fires, and something earthier she couldn't quite place and didn't care to identify. Deplorable, she murmured, adjusting her fox fur stole despite the mild weather. Absolutely deplorable. Her husband, Edmund Pemberton Clark III, had purchased the controlling interest in the Coleridge Mining Company 6 months prior, sight unseen, from his Boston office. The investment had seemed sound on a paper: rich coal seams, cheap labor, and plenty of it. What the paperwork hadn't conveyed was the utter primitiveness of the operation, and more horrifyingly, to Sarah's refined sensibilities, the backward state of the people who worked it. Sarah considered herself a progressive woman. She'd attended Vassar, belonged to 3 improvement societies, and had once shaken hands with a suffragette. She read books about social reform and had strong opinions about the proper ordering of society. And now, standing in this muddy hollow, surveying the ramshackle houses and rough-hewn people, she saw her opportunity for greatness. She would civilize Coleridge. The ideas had come to her in a flood of inspiration during the train ride south. These simple mountain folk needed guidance, structure, proper values. They needed to be lifted from their ignorance and shaped into productive, moral citizens. It was, she told herself, her duty as a woman of breeding and education. Her first reform began that very week. Sarah called a mandatory meeting at the company store, which also served as the only gathering place large enough to hold the miners and their families. About 200 people shuffled in, the men still black with coal dust from the morning shift, the women in their homespun dresses and flour sack aprons, children clinging to their skirts. Sarah stood before them in a tailored navy suit that had cost more than most of them earned in a year. "Good people of Coleridge," she began, her voice carrying the clipped tones of finishing school elocution. "I come before you today as a friend and benefactor. It has not escaped my notice that you live in a state of cultural deprivation. Your children run wild, your homes lack proper refinement, and your leisure time is spent in pursuits that can only be described as rustic at best, degrading at worst." She paused, expecting grateful attention. Instead, she noticed the miners exchanging glances, the women's faces hardening almost imperceptibly. "Therefore," Sarah continued, "I am implementing a comprehensive program of cultural improvement. First, all traditional music is hereby banned from company property. The banjos, fiddles, and other primitive instruments that encourage dancing and frivolity will be replaced with proper musical education. I've hired Professor Aldridge from the Philadelphia Conservatory to teach your children piano and classical voice." Old Granny Hicks, who'd been playing the banjo since before the Civil War, stood up slowly. "Ma'am, we ain't got no pianos." "They're being shipped from Boston as we speak," Sarah said with a tight smile. 6 of them. 1 for the school, 5 for the most deserving families, those who show the greatest improvement in their domestic arrangements and moral character. She unveiled her second reform. Furthermore, all folk remedies and mountain medicine are to cease immediately. I've brought a proper physician from Richmond who will provide scientifically sound medical care. The local herbalists are no longer permitted to practice their superstitions." This caused a stir. Widow McAllister, who'd midwifed half the hollow and could cure everything from croup to consumption with her teas and poultices, went pale. And finally, Sarah announced, "There will be mandatory etiquette classes every Sunday afternoon. You will learn proper table manners, appropriate conversation, and the social graces necessary for civilized living. Attendance is required for all families who wish to remain in company housing." She sat down, satisfied with her pronouncements, and waited for the gratitude she was certain would come. Instead, a heavy silence filled the room. Then Tom McCreary, a third-generation miner with hands like coal shovels and a quiet dignity Sarah had mistaken for simplicity, stood up. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said, his voice soft, but carrying an edge like a well-honed blade. "But Sunday afternoon is when we have our singing. Been doing it since my grandfather's time. It's when we gather, when we remember who we are." "Precisely the problem," Sarah said briskly. "You need to remember instead who you could become." The meeting ended in tense silence. Sarah's reforms were implemented with the full weight of company authority behind them. Instruments were confiscated. Granny Hicks's banjo was taken right off her porch, along with the Jessup boys' fiddles and the old dulcimer that had belonged to Sarah Whitlock's great-grandmother. The widow McAllister was informed that her medicine practice was terminated, and anyone caught visiting her for remedies would face eviction. The pianos arrived on a wet November morning, hauled up the mountain road by teams of mules. Professor Aldridge, a thin man with nervous hands and a chronic cough, set up in the schoolhouse and began his lessons. The children came because they had to. They sat at the pianos with their coal-stained fingers and tried to make sense of the strange black dots on the page. Most had learned music by ear, picking up melodies the way birds learn songs, by listening, by feeling, by living it. This new way, all rules and rigidity made no sense to them. "No, no, no," Professor Aldridge would shout, rapping knuckles with his baton. "The fingering is all wrong. Can't you see the notation? It's right there on the page." Young Betsy McCreary, who could make a mountain dulcimer sing like morning birds, stared at the sheet music with tears in her eyes. "I can't read it, sir." "Then you must learn. This is civilization, child. This is culture." But the music they made was stilted, dead. The notes came out technically correct, but empty, like trying to con sunlight or bottle a breeze. Meanwhile, Sarah's doctor from Richmond, a pompous man named Dr. Hartwell, who believed completely in the superiority of modern medicine over folk nonsense, set up his practice in a converted storage building. He treated the miner's black lung with tonics that did nothing. He scoffed at the idea that honey and whiskey could soothe a cough better than his expensive syrups. When little Annie Jessup came down with croup, he prescribed bed rest and cold compresses while forbidding the traditional steam tent with pine needles that had saved dozens of children before. Annie died on a Tuesday night. The grief that settled over the hollow was thick as the coal dust that never quite washed away. But it wasn't just grief. It was anger, quiet and deep. Sarah, insulated in her company house with its imported furniture and oriental rugs, noticed only that people seemed less resistant to her Sunday etiquette classes. She took this as progress. She was wrong. The people of Coleridge had survived things Lady Sarah Pemberton Clark couldn't imagine. They'd survived mine collapses and company scrip, floods and famines, feuds and influenza. They'd survived because they bent like mountain laurel in a storm, but they didn't break. And they knew how to resist in ways Sarah's educated mind couldn't comprehend. It started small. The pianos, those expensive symbols of culture, began to mysteriously malfunction. Keys stuck, strings broke. Professor Aldridge swore the children were sabotaging them, but he could never prove it. The humidity, the mountain folk explained innocently, plays havoc with delicate instruments, not like a good fiddle that could take whatever weather came. Sarah's etiquette classes were attended faithfully and completely undermined. The miners and their families showed up, sat politely, nodded at all the right times, and then went home and did exactly as they'd always done. They learned which fork to use for fish, then went home and ate beans with cornbread, scooping them up with the bread like their grandparents had. "Yes, ma'am," they said to everything. "Whatever you think best, ma'am." And then they lived their lives as they always had, just more quietly. The old music didn't die. It went underground. Literally. Deep in the mines, during lunch breaks, someone would pull out a harmonica small enough to hide in a pocket. The sound would echo through the tunnels, and men would hum along, the music mixing with the drip of water and the creak of timber, becoming part of the mountain itself. In the evenings, after Sarah had retired to her company house, families would gather in the deepest hollers where sound didn't carry. Someone would produce a hidden fiddle, and they'd play the old songs, the ballads brought from Scotland and Ireland, the tunes that had survived Indian raids and the Civil War, the songs that held their history and heartbreak, their joy and identity. Widow McAllister still practiced her healing arts, but now people came to her back door at night. She treated them by lamplight in her kitchen, mixing her poultices and teas, passing on her knowledge to young Rebecca Sutter, making sure the old ways would survive. Sarah noticed none of this. She saw only compliance, and she was pleased. By December, Sarah decided her reforms needed expansion. She'd observed that the miners' wives made their own clothes, quilted their own blankets, and preserved their own food in what she considered a terribly inefficient manner. "I've arranged," she announced at the Christmas gathering she'd mandated, "for a catalog system with Marshall Fields in Chicago. Rather than wasting time on home manufacture, you can order proper modern clothing at reasonable prices. The cost will be deducted from wages naturally. This will free up your time for more enriching pursuits." Mary Tom McCreary, who'd spent the last 6 months making a wedding ring quilt for her daughter's hope chest, felt something inside her go cold and hard. Sarah continued, "Additionally, the company store will now stock only modern preserved goods. These home canning operations are unsanitary and dangerous. I've read about botulism, you know." That was when quiet Ruth Whitlock, who'd never spoken up in her life, stood. "Mom, my grandmother taught me to can when I was 6 years old. My mother taught her. We've never poisoned. Nobody. That food in our cellars, that's what keeps us through the winter when the mine closes down and there's no wages coming." "The mine will provide," Sarah said dismissively. "Mr. Pemberton Clark is a fair employer." But the miners knew something. Sarah didn't. Every winter, when snow closed the mountain roads, the mine operated on reduced shifts. Wages dropped. The company store extended credit, but at rates that kept families in debt for generations. The food the women put up, the clothes they made, the skills they'd honed over generations. These things were the difference between surviving and starving. The winter was hard that year. The snow came early and stayed late. And when it came time for Sarah's mandatory Sunday gatherings, people started getting sick. Not truly sick, though that came later, but strategically sick. A household would send word that they couldn't attend due to illness. Dr. Hartwell would come, find symptoms vague and non-specific, and could do nothing but recommend rest. By the time one family recovered, another had taken ill. Sarah was frustrated, but not suspicious. These people have such weak constitutions, she complained to Edmund, who'd come down from Boston for the holidays. It's probably their inferior diet. Edmund, who'd spent his visit talking to the mine foreman and reviewing the books, was seeing things his wife wasn't. Sarah, production is down 30%. The men are working, but the efficiency has dropped off a cliff. The foreman says morale is terrible. Once they're properly cultured, they'll work better, Sarah insisted. You'll see. The end came not with a bang, but with a cough. In February, a flu swept through Coleridge. Dr. Hartwell treated it with his modern methods: isolation, cold compresses, expensive medicines ordered from Richmond. People died. Not many, but enough. Then Tom McCreary's youngest, little Emma, came down with it. Dr. Hartwell prescribed his usual remedies. Tom and Mary Tom nodded politely. And the moment the doctor left, Mary Tom ran through the snow to Widow McAllister's back door. The widow came, carrying her bag of herbs. She brewed elderberry tea and made a chest poultice from mustard and onion. She had Emma in a steam tent with pine and eucalyptus. She stayed 3 days straight. Emma lived. Word spread. Other families, terrified of losing their children like they'd lost Annie Jessup, began slipping away to the widow's house. Dr. Hartwell noticed his patient load dropping and reported to Sarah that the people were reverting to their superstitious ways. Sarah was incensed. She called another mandatory meeting. I have been patient, she announced, her voice shaking with anger. I have brought you culture, civilization, modern science, and you repay me with ingratitude and disobedience. The woman calling herself a healer is practicing medicine without a license. Anyone caught visiting her will be evicted immediately. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't submission. This was something Sarah's education hadn't prepared her for. Granny Hicks stood up, all 90 pounds and 87 years of her. Lady Sarah, she said, her voice like wind through dry leaves, you came here thinking we was ignorant, thinking we needed saving from ourselves. But you don't know nothing about us. You don't know that my banjo was made by my husband before he died in the mine collapse of '89. You don't know that Widow McAllister learned her healing from the Cherokee woman who saved her mama's life. You don't know that our music, our medicine, our ways, they ain't ignorance, they're survival. Superstition and sentiment, Sarah snapped. You need to embrace progress. Progress. Tom McCreary stood now, and there was something in his face that made even Sarah take a step back. You want to talk about progress, Ma'am. Your husband pays us in scrip that's only good at the company store. The store, where prices go up every month. You live in a house with running water while we haul ours from the creek. You talk about civilization while we breathe coal dust that's killing us by inches. And now, you want to take away the things that make our lives bearable, the music that lifts our spirits, the medicine that actually heals us, the skills that keep us alive. The room erupted, not in violence but in words, years of words held back by fear of eviction, by the need to feed their children, by the weight of company authority. Sarah fled to her company house, shocked and frightened. The next morning, Sarah woke to silence. Not the peaceful silence of early morning, but something else. Something wrong. She looked out her window and saw the mine entrance. No one was there. The miners had struck. Every single man had stayed home. They sat on their porches, played checkers, whittled. The women tended their gardens, worked on their quilts, visited with neighbors. The children played in the creek. They weren't protesting violently. They weren't making demands. They were simply not working. Edmund arrived 2 days later, furious. Do you have any idea what this is costing? The contracts, the shipments. We're losing thousands daily. They're being unreasonable, Sarah insisted. I was only trying to help them. Help them? Edmund had been talking to the foreman, to some of the older miners who'd agreed to speak with him. Sarah, do you know what you've done? You banned their music, the only free entertainment they have. You replaced their medicine with a doctor who's killed more than he's cured. You're trying to force them into debt, to buy things from catalogs when they can make better themselves. You're not helping them, you're destroying them. I was bringing them culture, refinement. You were bringing them your culture, your idea of refinement. Edmund ran his hands through his hair. These people have their own culture, Sarah. It's different from ours, but it's not inferior. Their music is as complex as anything coming out of Europe. The foreman has a degree from Princeton, and he tried to explain the modal structures to me. I understood about half of it. Their medicine is based on generations of empirical observation. Their crafts are skilled labor that takes years to master. Sarah sat down heavily. But they're so rough. They're coal miners in Appalachia, Sarah. They're exactly as refined as they need to be to survive here, which is more than can be said for us. Edmund looked at his wife with something like pity. I'm shutting down your reforms, all of them. The instruments are being returned. The widow can practice her medicine. The Sunday gatherings are voluntary, and Professor Aldridge is going back to Philadelphia. He wants to leave anyway, says the climate doesn't agree with him. But, no buts. This strike ends today, or we lose the mine entirely. Some of the men are already talking about bringing in the union. If that happens, we're finished here. The instruments were returned that afternoon. Old Granny Hicks got her banjo back and sat on her porch playing it, tears streaming down her face. The sound carried through the hollow like a hymn of homecoming. The pianos were sold to churches in Lexington. Sarah's etiquette manuals were quietly used as kindling. Professor Aldridge left on the next train, never to return. Dr. Hartwell stayed, but now he worked alongside Widow McAllister. He was surprised to find he could learn from her, that her remedies often worked better than his medicines. It wounded his pride, but it saved lives. Sarah stayed in Coleridge for another 6 months, but she was changed. She watched the people she'd tried to improve with new eyes, really watched them for the first time. She saw Mary Tom McCreary's quilts and recognized the geometry of patterns passed down through generations, each design telling a story. She heard the music echoing from the hollers and began to understand that it wasn't simple or primitive, but complex and rich with history. She watched young Rebecca Sutter learning medicine from Widow McAllister and realized she was witnessing the transfer of knowledge as valuable as anything taught at Vassar. One evening she found herself at a gathering in the hollow. Not a mandated meeting, but a real gathering, a wedding celebration. She stood at the edge, watching as fiddles and banjos played, as people danced reels and squares their ancestors had danced in Scotland and Ireland and England, transformed by the mountains into something uniquely their own. Granny Hicks noticed her and waved her over. "Come on and sit, Lady Sarah." "You want to watch, you might as well be comfortable." Sarah sat. For the first time since arriving in Coleridge, she didn't speak. She just listened. "You meant well," Granny Hicks said after a while. "That's the thing about folks from away. They see us and think we need fixing. Don't occur to them that maybe we're not broke." "I see that now," Sarah said quietly. "I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry." "Well," Granny said, "recognition of error is the first step toward wisdom. Least that's what my granny used to say." She paused, then added more gently, "You ain't all wrong, you know. Some things could be better here. The housing could be improved, the safety in the mines, fair wages, paid in real money, not scrip. Better schooling for the children. Those would all be good things." "But not at the cost of who you are," Sarah said. "No, ma'am, not at that cost." Sarah Pemberton Clark left Coleridge in May of 1928. She returned to Boston, but not to her improvement societies and reform movements. Instead, she wrote a book, not about how to civilize the backward people of Appalachia, but about what she'd learned from them. It wasn't a bestseller. The society women she'd once called friends were scandalized by its contents. But it was read by social workers and settlement workers, by reformers who were making the same mistakes she had. She titled it, "The Arrogance of Improvement, Lessons from Coleridge." In the introduction, she wrote, "I came to the mountains with the certainty that I had much to teach. I left with the humbling knowledge that I had far more to learn." The greatest cultural deficit in Coleridge was not in the people who lived there, but in the woman who presumed to know what was best for them without ever asking what they wanted, needed, or valued. This is my confession and my warning to others who would make the same mistakes. Back in Coleridge, life went on. The mines operated. The music played. The old ways survived, alongside what modernity proved truly useful. Some things changed. Better safety regulations, schools that taught reading and writing while respecting the knowledge passed down through generations, doctors who learned to work with healers instead of against them. But on Sunday afternoons, the hollow still, filled with music. Children learned the old songs from their grandparents, while also learning to read and write. Widow McAllister trained Rebecca Sutter and 3 other girls in the healing arts, while also learning from Dr. Hartwell about the genuine advances medicine had made. And sometimes, when the wind was right, you could hear Granny Hicks's banjo carrying through the mountains, playing the same tunes her grandmother had played, the same tunes her granddaughter would play, the sound of a culture that had bent but never broken, that had survived not despite its traditions, but because of them. The people of Coleridge had learned long ago what Lady Sarah had to travel hundreds of miles to discover, that progress without respect is tyranny, that help without humility is harm, and that the most important thing about any culture isn't how it looks to outsiders, but whether it sustains the people who live within it.